Cool. So welcome everyone to the QuantUniversity Artificial Intelligence Spring School. The last couple of months, we have been inviting experts from various disciplines to talk about the various aspects of AI enablement. We have primarily focused on large language models and generative AI. As you all know, the world has been taken over with discussions about how we can basically delegate everything we do, from critical thinking to generating documents to putting together PDF files to cooking recipes and doing art and generating music and generating videos, everything to generative AI. So the whole notion of the industry kind of catching up with all these trends means that we need to understand what's happening behind the scenes when we use these technologies. And unfortunately, with the way the world is moving, there's been a lot more black boxes today compared to having this notion of transparency and understanding what's actually happening. And that makes it difficult to professionals like us who really want to understand what actually happens behind the scenes. So we get the bits and pieces of the technical reports and the model cards and the nutrition labels and all the other cool things we can see very well formatted, probably also generated by AI. But we never get to see what actually happens behind the scenes and how do we measure accuracy, how do we measure risk. And coming from the financial services world, we always trust and only after we verify. And we are not able to do that in a very good way now. And I thought we could get some insights from the most important person in the room today is someone who has access to both the regulatory side of things on what's happening, which is Patrick, who was deeply involved with all the NIST efforts and all the ARMF and also the ARIA efforts, but also someone who is very well connected with the industry, trying to help them with solutions to the various challenges and problems they are seeing. It also has an academic hat at George Washington University, wherein he preaches what he practices. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but he also has a vision of where the world is going and where the world should be going. So Patrick and I, we have known each other for a really long time. If we can kind of look at like trajectories, we kind of have similar trajectories. I was at MathWorks and you were at SAS and doing risk and teaching at university. So I can resonate with his thinking process, and I always enjoy discussions with him whenever we get a chance. And whenever in DC, I make sure that I definitely buzz him like, hey, if you're free, let's grab a drink and see if we can, chat some more. So it's my immense pleasure to have Patrick Hall, who has multiple hats: Hall Research, ex-B&H, H2O, or maybe even he's still collaborating with H2O on various aspects, influencer in various ways in how NIST is actually putting together various frameworks. And also wears multiple hats in the context of speaking at various conferences, collaborating with like-minded friends like Agus and Nick and others. So I leave it at that, Patrick. I know you have a really long resume, but people already know you. So welcome to the QuantUniversity AI Spring School. And today's discussion will primarily focus on measurement in AI. And I know Patrick has some very strong thoughts about it. So we'll use the next half an hour to 40 minutes or so for the presentation, and then we'll go with Q&A. A couple of notes for people who are listening in the audience. Please type in where you're joining in from. And also, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A panel. I'll be moderating. And if there are any questions which are contextual, I'll bring it up with Patrick. And we'll try to save the last 10, 15 minutes for an open Q&A before we adjourn for today's session. Take it away, Patrick. Welcome to the program again.
Perfect. And really kind introduction. Thank you. And happy to be here. So yeah, I have I don't know. I've always been kind of a contrarian, and one thing that I keep going back to over and over again these days, is my original training was in physical chemistry. And I'm one of those people that left quote unquote hard science in the 2000s and went into data science. but my scientific training remains with me. And a part of that training was to be skeptical, not to be credulous and naive, not to accept claims that until you're able to independently reproduce them. And so I think, there's different ways you could think about this presentation I'm going to do. One is it's an attempt to enumerate assumptions about AI that maybe go unsaid a lot of the time, or undocumented a lot of the time. And then, another way to think about this presentation is just critique. And I always point out to my students, uh, critique is important. Critique is how we move the field forward. And just because I critique AI doesn't mean I don't use it or something like that, or I don't ask my students to use it. And so I think a question I get from my students a lot is like, hey, you're telling us all this bad stuff about AI, but you're also telling us to use it. And yeah, that's how we do things, right? Like, you can read a book and you can read a critique of the book, and both can be good and interesting, and have different opinions. So I think providing critique for a field and providing critique for AI is really important. And I would challenge people, if AI is what it typed up to be, then why can't it stand a little critique and oversight? So let's dive in. All right, so like I mentioned in sort of the preliminary comments, I'm going to talk about some critique aspects, in particular around measurement of AI performance and risk, and just other malpractice that I've seen so many times that I've come up with little names and funny ways to talk about. And then I want to change gears and talk about what people are doing for this, right? Like, critique for critique's sake is mildly interesting to me. Critique to move the field forward, I think, is much more important and interesting. Okay. All right. So I think, I'm mainly talking about generative AI in this presentation, but not exclusively. I just reviewed papers for a prominent, sort of responsible AI conference, and they were not good. No design of experiment, no measurement of variance across 5 different papers. And I would say that's fairly common. And I would say I'm guilty of all those things too. I mean, my papers get rejected for not doing those things as well, because they're time consuming. But so main focus here is generative AI, but I'm not speaking exclusively about generative AI, and I'm not, people in the responsible AI community have a lot of work to do when it comes to science as well. So, the first thing, the easy call out here is evals and benchmarks. And I would describe my main sort of problem with evals and benchmarks. I know people put a ton of time and work into these. Some of those people actually do think about scientific measurement. I have friends that work on ML Commons, friends and colleagues that work on the ML Commons benchmark. But my main critique that I don't think there's any way around with benchmarks is you're living in video game world. If you think that a test data set, even if it's a complicated test data set made up by smart graduate students, can represent the nuance, dynamism, and complexity of the real world, then I'm not sure I can help you, right? There's no spreadsheet that can represent the complexity of the real world. And that may be a philosophical comment, and that may be sort of the core of where people might disagree with me. But I long ago stopped believing that training data was necessarily accurate or objective. And I don't believe that the sort of complexity of the universe the real universe can be, represented in a spreadsheet or other training data. So whenever we're dealing with benchmarks, we're just dealing with some simplified version of the real world. We're not dealing with the real world. And it's great if systems do well on benchmarks, but what's better is if they do well in the real world. And I think the connection between benchmarks and the real world is, sometimes better, but often worse. Then when you really dig into the benchmark, aside from this fundamental problem that benchmarks just aren't the real world, they tend to focus on performance. Performance is good. We need to be able to measure performance, but we also need to be able to measure risk. And of course, there's Helm, and I'm very familiar with all the different types of benchmarks, and I've taxonomized them and these kinds of things. There are some benchmarks for measuring risk, but I think in particular, measuring risk in some abstract way is perhaps even more dangerous than measuring performance in some abstract way. So I think benchmarks tend to focus on performance, less so on risk, and I would claim that measuring and managing risk is even perhaps that's an even more dangerous thing to do with benchmarks. These things are plagued by conflicts of interest. I simply do not get why people accept when company X says, hey, this model that I'm selling to you, it's great. Look, we tested it. That's a conflict of interest. And I just don't understand why people accept it. That company X says the product it's selling is great, is irrelevant from my perspective. So they're plagued by conflicts of interest. They're made by the vendors, and then the vendors run, their own tools through them and say that they perform well on them. They oftentimes test really questionable capabilities like self-awareness and emotional understanding. I get that generative AI is really hyped up, but the fundamentals of computers have not changed. I don't understand how a computer in 2025 can have self-awareness or emotional understanding. Those things are simply outside the domain of computation. Moreover, testing these kinds of fake things promotes hype, right? And I would say almost in a bad faith way. And let me give you an example. I am going to publish a human flight benchmark, okay? I can make my sad, pathetic 45-year-old body jump like 6 or 8 inches off the ground today. But next year, I'm going to be flying all over the place. Look at the trend in my human flight benchmark. So I think these benchmarks, things like self-awareness, emotional understanding, they're analogous to a human flight benchmark. Humans aren't going to be able to fly anytime soon and probably never naturally. But I can make a benchmark and draw a trend line towards human flight, and then I can try to sell human flight. And I think, that's the most cynical interpretation of some of these benchmarks. They're hard to reproduce in certain cases. They can lack standardization and consistency, especially across eval suites or benchmarks. And then there's the issue of task contamination, which I'll talk about later, that I think really compromises a lot of these benchmarks. It stands in stark comparison to scientific measurement, which again, we have a slide about later, and so I'll move on. All right. This is kind of a corollary to issues with benchmarks, but it applies to leaderboards. It applies to any metric that we use to evaluate AI systems in data. If we're not bringing in real world signals, then this issue applies. So it's known as Goodhart's law, and I think this graph actually explains a lot. And this is taken from a blog, which I criticize. I criticize taking important information from blogs, but here, look, I'm doing it myself. But I find this graphic to be really helpful, and I think that people like me and my colleagues are sitting up here, and we're saying, oh my gosh, all these things that we care about, generative AI is actually making them worse. And I think a lot of tech people are down here looking at benchmark performance. I'm looking at things in the real world and saying, ew, like I don't love generative AI. Whereas I think a lot of technicians and people in the tech industry are on this line, and they're looking at ever decreasing benchmark performance and saying, oh, AGI is around the corner. So I think Goodhart's law plays a really important role here, because it's just well understood that anytime there's a benchmark or a metric, people can optimize towards that metric. If that metric sort of lives off in video game world and not in the real world, which I would claim a lot of AI metrics do, then you can get a very clear separation from what the metric is actually measuring and the real world phenomenon that it's supposed to be measuring. And so I think this slide goes a long way in showing, like, why are there people like me out there who are like, I don't think generative AI is that great. I don't want to use it in everything. I question a lot of its capabilities, and then you've got the whole tech industry wrapped up in this insane hype cycle. I think this graph kind of shows how that could happen. But just in general, if we're measuring something in data without checking back in with the real world, without checking back in with users and real world inputs, then this phenomenon of Goodhart's law can kick in, and we can start having a proxy measurement issue. And I would say with benchmarks, I think we're measuring a proxy in many cases, and that proxy is something like how much resources tech companies put into doing well on the benchmarks, not necessarily, real world performance. Okay. So here's the task contamination one. Just like traditional machine learning, and this can apply to maybe quote unquote task contamination doesn't apply to traditional machine learning, but data contamination and data leakage, and it's the same idea, certainly applies to more traditional machine learning. It's always been super easy to cheat and cheat yourself in machine learning. And I'm not sure generative AI makes it any difference there. It's really easy to cheat and cheat yourself in generative AI. And there's good evidence, that you can see the papers down at the bottom, that vendors and open source models are trained on data that should be used to hold, should have been held out for evaluation purposes, including the benchmarks that the makers of the model then point to and say, look how great we are. So again, this is kind of like a corollary on the benchmark issue, but it also applies, everything also applies to all kinds of AI. So there is a serious issue where either by accident or on purpose, these benchmarks, the performance of models on benchmarks, what's reported is overly optimistic because they've been trained somehow on the benchmark, okay? And in the most cynical interpretation, which I do think applies sometimes, this is the same idea as like a student breaking into my office, stealing an exam key from those drawers back behind me, memorizing it, and then coming to take the test. Of course, they're going to perform much better than they normally would. And, so I don't think that, again, machine learning has a long history of cheating yourself, not being reproducible. And I would say that task contamination just plays into that long history. And it's not even surprising that this happens. And again, I think we should be demanding much more transparency about the data that goes into these systems. And I think oftentimes we find that it's evaluation data in many cases. All right. This, the notion that AI is so capable today that I don't even know, it's somehow going to get hold of the nuclear weapons and blow us all up, or terrorists are going to use it to make super viruses. I don't know. ChatGPT calls me Lisa all the time and can't do half the things I ask it to do, and it's a box without arms. So I'm confused by this existential risk narrative. I'm not saying it's fully wrong, but what I am saying is I think it's not particularly realistic, and it's clearly being used by people in powerful positions to divert attention away from AI's current problems and sort of the current consumer and democratic harms that are due to AI, right? If I'm a big company making AI, it's much easier for me to talk about sort of sci-fi fantasy problems in the future than to deal with non-discrimination, data privacy, intellectual property infringement. Those things are expensive and would have to be dealt with today. Whereas this sort of notion of, oh, AI is super powerful and going to blow us all up, that's what we really need to care about. It's a way for people who want to use that in bad faith to say, we don't need to do anything about bias, privacy, and intellectual property infringement. And again, in the most cynical interpretation, it's being used that way on purpose. And if you haven't read, I believe her first name is Rachel, but I'm not sure, Goodhart in the Harvard Data Science Review on this topic, I really recommend you do. It's a short paper, and it's one of the best things I read last year. It's funny. It's a funny paper. Okay, so again, like whenever people start talking about existential risk and emergent capabilities, I go and bash my head against the wall, and then I come back and politely point them towards more realistic risk. And again, I'm not trying to dismiss this point. Like I think that AI can be very dangerous. And I think we see that in sort of youth mental health, addiction, and well-being. we see that in sort of automated surveillance and social credit scoring, which is, people tend to associate with the Chinese state, but I think we could look other places and see a lot of the same stuff. Deep fakes and disinformation. I work on the AI incident database, and in recent months, we've just been inundated by reports of extortion, blackmail, non-consensual pornography. Like, that is a major, major thing that generative AI is used for, and no one cares. If you're the victim of non-consensual imagery, you have very few legal, ways to seek legal recourse, and that's horrible, right? That's just a failure of government, and not on either side of the aisle. But the fact that people can use generative AI to make harmful material about specific people, and there's very little legal recourse for those people, is just shocking, and a failure of government, not a failure of a political partisan party, just a failure of government, in my opinion. Um, so I do think that there are real quote unquote X risk. I like to talk about X risk because, I think if the field was more serious, they wouldn't have made a fun little hyphenated phrase for existential risk. But again, I just don't, my main feeling about this generative AI, the existential risk narrative, is that it's used in bad faith by people who don't want to do anything to fix the problems about their AI today, who know for sure that generative AI isn't as powerful as they say it is. There, and so in particular, I'm talking about things like acceleration, acquiring resources, avoiding being shut down. I just, if I was a bank, this is not what I would be focused on today. I would be focused what's on the other side of the slide. These are the risks that I would say are more realistic, and I would say that traditional risk management works just fine for them. I've had conversations with people saying, "Oh, you can't have a risk-based standard for generative AI because you can't target the use cases, and you can't, it's capable of so many things." And I reject that on its face. No, you just use it for a certain application, and you manage the risk of that application. I think that traditional risk management can certainly be applied to generative AI. It's just expensive and slow, and people aren't that interested in it. It's more fun to say it's too powerful for risk management. Okay. When I moved over from chemistry to data science in the aughts, it was immediately apparent to me that there were no adults in the room, right? That you could make wild, crazy claims, and there was no, old senior professor sitting on your committee who was going to wreck you, right? So I think that it's an immature culture which has really serious problems with credulity and naivete. I've seen executives have discussions that roughly go along the lines of, "Hey, did you know generative AI could fly a space shuttle? No, wow, that's amazing." That is not science, right? So again, like, I reject marketing and hype-driven claims on their face, and I think everyone else should too, but of course they won't. I believe claims that are independently replicated by non-commercial entities, and very little in generative AI has been replicated by non-commercial entities. And so I think we're really in a place where we don't know what generative AI is actually capable of. But again, I would look out to the data science community and say, please stop accepting marketing and hype as scientific results. I don't think that will happen anytime soon, but maybe we will get lucky. Again, language models are wrong. ChatGPT calls me Lisa all the time. No, don't really know why. Language models hurt people. People use language models for horrible things. People hack language models. Things are hacked and abused all the time. Again, like, another thing that kills me with sort of naivety and credulity in the space is, like, you spend a lot of time building the system, and your company spent a lot of time, time and money building it, and now you're going to pretend it's perfect and it can't be manipulated. Like, it boggles the mind. But I would say that that's the most common mindset that I run across. There's also a huge issue with human cognitive bias. Look, I've been a data scientist in Silicon Valley. If we took the confirmation bias, groupthink, funding bias out of the practice of data science, sometimes I'm not sure what would be left. I have been involved in data science projects that I feel like were just the pure productization of confirmation bias. And I'm not, like, everybody that was around just said, yes, this would work. The executive said, yes, this would work. No one provided any effective challenge or critique. The thing went out the door, and although it clearly never worked, people just kept saying it worked, right? And so I think that we fail to consider our own human cognitive biases in when we're assessing the performance of generative AI systems. And that's one of the main things that the scientific method is for, is to allow us to do that. I'll also highlight that I've really become interested in the McNamara fallacy, or the quantitative fallacy. And this is a fallacy that's well known to social scientists, that says people like us, irrationally think that quantitative data and decisions based on quantitative data are better than decisions based on non-quantitative data. And I do believe that's a fallacy. I no longer think that quantitative, data and data-driven decision-making are better than other ways of making decisions. I think it's very clear to me, if you want the best possible decisions, you need to apply, the best principles from computer science and from social science. And again, like, you just have to stay humble, because bad things can happen to anyone in this field at any time, even people who get on webinars and, tell other people what to do. So, you just have to stay humble. All right, this is probably my favorite slide, but I do, I want to respect the time and leave time for questions, so I'll go quickly here. People just make wild claims about AI all the time. I actually had to get off social media nearly completely. I know I did a post for this talk, and I assume that's why some people are here, but I hadn't done anything but a post about my students in years, because I just couldn't handle the discourse on social media. It's insane. People are talking about magic, every single, so probably, does the claim use the word magic? That gets like 5% of claims about AI. I do like to go to conferences and see how often magic is used in the brochure versus risk, and it's a lot more than risk. There's just massive conflicts of interest, and nobody cares. It's shocking to me. Again, that, someone selling you something, telling you that thing is good, that's not science. But that seems to be like the main driver of the discourse on generative AI. And again, I would say this plays into people's careers as well. Like, being the person at the company that talks like me, that's going to get you fired, which is going to cost you money. Being the person at the company that's like, rah, 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 generative AI, your career is going to go up the ladder. And so again, I would say that's a conflict of interest. Like, if I know all I have to do is get more money, is to push forward some broken generative AI solution, great. There's many people that are perfectly willing to do that, let me assure you. When it's free, your data is the product. There's nothing in the world that doesn't have assumptions and limitations, not even generative AI. Some of the biggest papers in this field aren't peer reviewed and probably wouldn't pass peer review. And again, like, I just cannot boggle when people that call themselves professional data scientists show information without measurement of variance. That's unforgivable. And so performance will vary with these systems because they're statistical in nature, and hallucinations can't be fixed because they're random error in a statistical system. So, we don't want to acknowledge these things. All right, so what are we doing about this? This is kind of a funny thing that I've written about several times. It's my interpretation of how the typical process, which I engage in a lot, what I'm calling the data scientific method here, is really a violation of the scientific method. When we get data and then go looking for a hypothesis in that data, and then use the same data to confirm that hypothesis, and then if we didn't confirm the hypothesis, change our hyperparameters until we do confirm the hypothesis, like, that's just a blatant violation of the scientific method, but also standard operating procedure in data science. And again, I've engaged in it myself plenty of times. I do think we could hold ourselves to a higher standard, and that certain people are starting to do this. And the basic idea is you define an experiment, not based on which algorithm is the most magical, but based on, real world outcomes. You design an experiment to assess real world outcomes, then you include things like baselines and controls, randomizations, blinding, multiple measurements in your design. and then you look for statistically significant treatment effects. And if possible, apply formal validation and wait for independent replication of results. I would, if the process on, on the right here was what had been applied to build things like ChatGPT, I wouldn't be sitting here complaining. I would be saying this is incredible. I don't think we would have gotten to something like ChatGPT by applying this, though. We would have gone a different direction a long time ago. Okay, so there's a program at NIST, National Institutes of Standards and Technology, a non-political government agency that focuses on developing standards and measurement for different parts of the economy. I'm involved in this process. I'm a subcontractor. That team is developing a scientific measurement process for AI systems, and the first run of it will be on language models. And you can participate, like if you're a vendor and you want to join in on this and have your systems be measured in this way, you can join in. It'll be run, if you're familiar with the NIST work in facial recognition, the other AI evaluations that NIST has done, same idea. It's all public taxpayer funded work, and the ARIA will measure three different types of signals. So it will measure model testing, and this is like benchmarking, but we're not using benchmark data because we just can't find a benchmark that aligns to what we're trying to test. So sort of like handmade prompts for models to respond to, red teaming, trying to break the system, and then field testing. So conducting actual human subjects experiments that measure how people interact with AI systems in the wild, and combining that with user experience questionnaires into a sophisticated, scientific measurement system that combines these signals and provides sort of information at different scales and levels across performance and risk characteristics. Okay, so it's not just benchmarking, it's benchmarking plus red teaming plus field testing plus user experience, all of those signals combined into a scientific measurement instrument. And we're trying to assess both performance and risk. So again, watch for NIST ARIA. And vendors are welcome to participate in it, and many vendors do participate in the NIST facial recognition evaluation. Another scientific measurement effort that I followed along with, like Tree said, is with H2O, and it's more automated. So H2O calls it human calibrated automatic testing. It's more automated, which I don't love, but I acknowledge that no company is going to invest in the time and money it takes to do something like NIST ARIA. That might not be true. I'll show on the next slide where some of the big tech labs are starting to do this kind of testing or write about this kind of testing. But I think it'll mainly fall just in the biggest sort of commercial research labs and biggest government research institutes to do this kind of very heavy duty testing. One thing that I forgot to mention about ARIA is we're not using language models or SPACY or NLP to assess results. It's pure human assessment, which is very time consuming and expensive. And again, that's another thing that drives me crazy here. People turn in results with generative AI. They're like, well, we counted the entities in this with SPACY, or, this sentiment classifier says X. Those things are often totally wrong. And I just don't understand how that can form the basis of measurement. Sentiment classifiers break easily. I've never seen a natural entity recognition system really work 100% of the time, right? So I think whenever we do these automated measurements, we're sort of building approximation upon approximation upon approximation. And when we get to the top, you can kind of look at the results however you want to. ARIA will be full human evaluation, which is very expensive and time consuming. All right, so the H2O approach recognizes that human labeling is necessary, right? There's no automatic way to assess the performance of generated text. There are ways to trick yourself into hoping that some automatic way can really assess what's going on in generated text. But my strong feeling today is it's all approximate. Any metric we might use to assess generated text is approximate. So if we want good measurements, we have to at least calibrate to human labeling. And that's what the H2O approach does. So what I like about the H2O approach is it tries to design an experiment. It does so automatically. And an important thing about the H2O approach is it's focused on RAG systems, retrieval augmented generation systems. That's really, really important and different than just a language model on its own, because in the RAG scenario, we get input control back. We get control over the input data back. We're not just reliant on, billions of documents on the internet. We can control what's in the RAG. So we get input control. My understanding is it's going to look through the RAG documents and sort of build out clusters of documents and then try to build automated test cases to get coverage across all those types of documents in the RAG system. So that thinking around experimental design and test coverage, I think is very important. It also uses embeddings, and this is another thing that I talk to people about all the time. Please consider embedding-based metrics over benchmarks. Right? You can embed, you can access your model's embeddings, maybe not. And if you can't, you can embed your model's outputs. You can embed your model's inputs. You can do testing on your data, not some data that was made by Mechanical Turks or graduate students that has nothing to do with what you're doing. You can test your own data if you use embeddings. And that's a key part of the H2O process as well. And then there's a human calibration step where they sort of sample some of the automated test cases and the responses of automated test cases, get human labels for that, and build a classifier, a conformal classifier, a classifier that predicts confidence intervals, basically, as opposed to point estimates, for whether future assessments by the system fall within the range of human labeling. And if they don't fall within the range of human labeling, if too many sort of test results are coming out outside the range of past human labeling, then that's a time, that's a good signal to go in and see what's going on with your testing and, either fix your testing or rerun your calibration. So those are, those are the two efforts that I followed the most closely. I was sort of inspired to talk about this because like the who's who list of responsible AI just published a paper about, how we need evaluation science in generative AI. I go to AI Snake Oil a lot. That's a blog by Princeton professors that sort of highlights very silly things in the AI space, and they talk about measurement a lot. Here's one example over here. And then, like I kind of hinted at, you see Microsoft Research, and you especially see Microsoft Research and Google DeepMind at least acknowledging and moving towards ideas from social science, ideas from socio-technical measurement, and I think that's a great sign. And I my guess as to why they're doing that is because they realized it's necessary. And then I'll just quickly point out, like, I have conflicts of interest. I work on this stuff. I get paid to work on this stuff. I have a little consulting LLC that gets reviewed very hard by GW attorneys every year. And it's not just me. That would be a horrible thing to say. There's my former colleague at NIST, Riva Schwartz, has created a company, and it would be hard to think of someone who's done more to further AI measurement in recent years than Riva. She just started a company that I believe is called Vernaculab. There's the former Twitter responsible AI team that formed a measurement group that goes on, that's a nonprofit called Humane Intelligence. I believe that people are, I'd like to get more information than this. I'm not going to put it in writing, but I believe people are sort of circling up to form a loosely affiliated group around this type of measurement issue called Civitas. So there are both sort of high level efforts and grassroots efforts. And yeah, so things are happening in this space, and I think they're really important for driving the field forward, as opposed to just getting better results in video game world. So I'll shut up. I probably talked too long, but not too bad. And yeah, so happy to hear some questions or some feedback.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much, Patrick. This was very enlightening, and thanks for kind of consolidating all the efforts, both on your end and also what's happening in the world, both on the company side and also on the academic side, and kind of, consolidating it. I like the contrarian thought. I mean, as risk managers and risk professionals are always contrarians. You can't just go with the flow. You always need to think outside the box, and you got to also think about, like, how do we make sure that the discussion is focused enough on ensuring that we get the best outcomes, rather than just having a specific agenda and reinforcing that particular agenda, right? And I think you mentioned some aspects about, the conflicts of interest. I mean, conflicts of interest, there is always this marketing spiel, right? Like, companies are there to sell products. So it's always their say. I mean, I still see, late night television marketing knives, and I bought some of those knives, and they arrived blunt, and they don't cut the tomatoes the way I saw them cut the tomatoes, and they never, hold on to their life, and they rust very easily. I think that's kind of the state of the art in anything, right? It's buyer beware, and you got to make sure that as consumers of AI, you got to be aware of what you're buying into, how much do you trust, and also when you think about implementing a solution within your enterprise, you do the due diligence and not just rely on somebody else's
Yeah,
benchmark. Right?
I,
Because
I
how
think
many
that's a
people?
great,
Yeah, just want
really
to comment
quickly, I would say, why do people think AI products are any different from every other product on the market out there? Right?
on.
They're not. They're just full of scams, like everything else. Okay. Like why are people pretending AI is different than every other product on the market?
Yeah, so that's the important thing, right? Because there is the enigma. We haven't seen
Yeah.
something like this before. We have never seen what you call as this tool which actually performs like us in some ways. We have
In
never,
some ways.
we have never seen something which was so cool, if you will, right? I mean, like, we kind of went through the same or similar phase when we saw the internet, right? So, oh, you can actually buy something and it comes to your door in a few days. Oh, wow, this never was possible before, right? And then we started seeing, okay, that's the norm. But then today, when you see this confident answers coming out, we always get a feel like, oh, it is something we could potentially trust because someone else must have done the due diligence, right? And I think to be frank, I use generative AI tools a lot. I mean, I more or less spend more than $100 on personal tools, on different tools I use to enhance my presentations, dub certain things, edit certain things, get some ideation going. I think there is some, what do you call as power in some of those work reducing efforts, if you will. However,
Oh, definitely. Like I have a RAG system pulled up on my other screen. Like if I was just to share my left monitor,
yeah,
you would see like a RAG system that I built on NIST AI RMF stuff that I use that greatly accelerates and makes my work much more efficient, on future NIST AI RMF work. So I want to be clear, like I'm not saying there's no promise here. I think my strong negative reactions are to the hype and the marketing.
yeah,
I think if ChatGPT had been introduced as never write a boring email again in your life, and in 20 to 50 years we'll have something really cool, I wouldn't be giving this presentation, right? It's the hype and the credulity and the naivete that makes me insane.
right. And I think the other part, which I mean, coming from a mechanical engineering and formal engineering background, right? So I think we have so much state of the art in terms of validating systems, so much state of the art in terms of writing software
Right.
and putting it out, and process engineering, software engineering best practices. I think we are kind of, skipping some of those efforts to think about, what should we be doing to appease an audience who may not have the right technical skills to actually understand all these aspects, and how do we kind of, make them, you know, convinced that we have done the due diligence, you don't need to worry, kind of a thing. So as you know, I've been a big proponent of not just relying on model cards and data cards and things like that. Those are like minuscule efforts wherein you can see a benchmark and say, hey, I am better than others just because I am on this leaderboard. That doesn't mean anything if you have an application which is completely different in the testing data set which they were using to validate their findings, right? It could be accurate for a particular test, right?
Another thing I would point out is that a position on a leaderboard is absolutely meaningless if the leaderboard doesn't report margins of error or other measurements of variance, which most machine learning leaderboards I see do not report those things. And so again, if you haven't thought about this, if you're listening, and you should reject on its face a leaderboard that doesn't have margins of error or other measurements of variance. It's meaningless disinformation.
Right. Absolutely. And again, the other important part, I think you mentioned this a couple of times, is, and again, we coming from the financial services world have a formal understanding of what model risk is. And, Agus and I and Jacob and Nick and others, we have had multiple discussions on this. It's about having the context, because, just the technology in isolation and measuring the capabilities of something doesn't mean that I can actually do the work I want to do with that particular tool. So going back to the knife and the tomato example, this knife may cut rocks, but it doesn't do anything for me. It cannot, if it cannot cut tomatoes, right? Because I want to use it for cutting tomatoes. And if it cannot do that job, then it's absolutely useless. So the measurement without context is something I really, really have a hard time understanding, because you are kind of putting together all these metrics without really understanding whether it could be applied in a particular use case. And that's where I think the personal responsibility comes in, wherein you got to have a very clear understanding of where you're going to be applying these tools and what should that mean. That's the whole reason why financial companies have this whole independent model validation, having a specific audit role, having a specific risk department, having budgets for these departments to be in place for the first, and then also the authorities of who's reporting to whom, right? So SRA 11.7 and the UK Prudential Authorities, like all these agencies have come up with frameworks. And I'm kind of just, it's mind-boggling that we don't really see that level of what you call formality, which has already been done in that discipline, being adopted in the generative AI sense, in the context of how do we actually make it more specific to the job which it's need to be done, right?
Well, all right. So I just learned a really interesting phrase, and I'm not an expert in I feel I am an expert in the formal validation of machine learning systems, but I don't feel like I'm an expert in the sort of social science concept of validity. But I did, I had an interesting discussion based on the slides that I shared with the professor at the University of Colorado who was talking about ecological validity, which my understanding of that is basically like, does what you're talking about work in the real world? Like there's a well-known issue of things working in the lab versus things working in the real world. And if things work in the lab but don't work in the real world, you might say that they have a lack of ecological validity. And me and you have talked about context a lot, right? And I again, like, I think one reason why I've just become really just have a really strong distaste for the current AI discourse is it really does totally dismiss, basic ideas from social science and the humanities. It totally dismisses basic ideas from statistics. And I just don't want to work like that. And so these ideas from social science around validity, I think, are extraordinarily important and are going to be difficult to apply to AI systems. But if we did it, we would learn a lot, and the AI systems performance in the real world versus their performance on a benchmark could potentially change a lot as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I want to also address some of the questions which a couple of
Yeah, of
people
course.
are asking. One question Satyaki has asked is like, how do we create these test cases? Would using an independent LLM or SLM advisable? If so, should a closed loop test case generation process be used, or an open loop system generating the use case should be used?
Well, I would back it out from your use case. I don't follow the question exactly, but I would back it out from your use case, and I would use it if I'm designing test cases, I would start with my use cases. My use case, I would make sure the test cases are aligned with the use cases, and then I would apply experimental design. And so what that means, like I do a lot of work in fair lending and the use of generative AI and how that could potentially impact fair lending. And so when I design prompts for fair lending testing, red teaming is what I prefer over model testing. I try to think about my experimental factors, and oftentimes the experimental factors are dialect, language, names that are strongly coded towards one racial group or one gender. The product, whether it's a credit product or a mortgage product or a home equity line of credit product, thinking about your experimental factors, thinking about your use case and your experimental factors, and using that to inform the generation of prompts or test cases, I think is really important.
Perfect. A couple of other questions. I'll try to keep it quick. I know we are kind of close to the 1 o'clock mark. Do you have any insights from your crystal ball on where the NIST area project is going, and if any results will be published at the end of this project?
I think it's a very tough time for our friends in the federal government, unfortunately. I think it's hard to say exactly where things might go. But as of today, ARIA continues as planned. I think there's been a lot of turnover associated with the change in administration, not necessarily anything beyond turnover. But I think there was a slowdown with a lot of things, which is normal around the change of administration. And my impression is work is starting back up again. And I think it's possible that if things stay on track, there will be results from the pilot, within some reasonable time frame.
Awesome. Cool. So I think, Patrick, you got to get back on your LinkedIn and start answering some questions, man. There are so many questions out there, and probably.
All right. Well, people have to
next
stop
2 days.
giving 4,000 likes to things with anecdotal measurement, and then I'll start playing more on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
One thing that drives me crazy is it's professors who have financial relationships with these companies who are sharing that stuff, and they don't disclose their financial relationships. So anyway, I find it just endlessly
That's a
frustrating.
discussion
I'll
for
shut up
another
though.
day. Me being
Yeah.
an academic, have my own thoughts on the whole equation. But
Yeah.
I know we are kind of at 1 o'clock. I actually wanted to share something, and this is kind of just because there has been so much interest in all the lectures we have been having so far. And Patrick's session was the 8th session in the QuantUniversity AI School session. So we have had lectures with Agus on testing and validating generative AI applications. We have had Jacob Kassoff talk about use and governance of generative AI in financial organizations. Then we had Postal. You probably know Postal from NIST. So he has written a whole paper on adversarial machine learning. So he presented his work there. And then we had Christoph and Julia talk about navigating MRM issues in banking. And then we had Uday talk about LLMs in production, and he talked about his book. And then we had a whole session on navigating generative AI and model risk management. Rafiq did a wonderful talk about this whole aspect. And Dagash from BlackRock talked about how do we choose a threshold and evaluation metric in large language models. In today's session, Patrick, you had a great session on measurement in AI. So we have had like 8 sessions, and it's a whole course by itself. So we actually have put together a whole 8-module course. So you will actually become experts if you just go through all these. So this is our new platform. It's called the Q Skill Bridge, and it basically enables you to kind of learn. And we are going to be creating more and more materials using this. And we have put all these presentations, and you can just treat them as modules, go and see each one of them. And then you have all the content and the associated things. And we are also trying to create some assessments and potentially also certify you once you learn through these, and then maybe even get to the materials. But this is like 8 hours of packed content, which is already there. And then we are going to be augmenting more and more courses in here. There is like risk stress testing and AI and big data and various other courses which will come through this platform. So I've shared the link on how to access this. It's on QSkillBridge, so on your Zoom chat. And if you're interested, you can register and you can access all the lectures and all the videos for free, and you can learn from the experts. So thank you again.
And I suspect Agus was talking about the HCAT. I suspect that first video, Agus was talking about what I was talking about, and it would be more detailed.
Yeah, so he actually did a presentation. It was a wonderful presentation. I mean, like, I was
it's really cool
with Agus today. So he's going to be talking about his new work with Modiva, and then he's going to talk about like how that could potentially be used in various applications. Now, one thing I wanted to also mention is like next week, York Kennett, so he has spoken at the QuantUniversity session before. So he's going to be doing a whole session on leveraging generative AI for financial data. And he's going to be using Gaussian processes. And he's a quant by heart. He has written multiple books on risks. And if you are quants and if you are interested in understanding how generative AI could be used for both generation of synthetic data and applying it in financial context, please stay tuned for next week's session with York Kennett. We'll be posting details of his session very soon. And again, Patrick, it's always a pleasure. We should do a coffee or drink or lunch next time we are in DC or next time you come to Boston. And people who joined us today, thank you again for spending your lunch break with us. And we will see you soon with another wonderful session with another speaker who's going to be talking about what they've been working on. Thanks again, Patrick. Enjoy the day.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.